A couple of weeks ago, Bethesda invited us out to Germany to play Doom: The Dark Ages ahead of its May 15th Game Pass launch, and I was blown away. And I'm going to tell you about everything I got to experience, everything I got to play, plus I'm going to show you some exclusive game capture that I managed to get. Lucky you. So sit back, relax, and let me take you through exactly how everything works in Doom: The Dark Ages. Let me kick this off by explaining what we actually got to play at this preview event. So there were 4 levels that we could try out. The first one was basically a small preview of the first couple of chapters of the game with some of the cutscenes and a bit of gameplay. Then we also got a snapshot of the Mecha-Dragon flying through a different level, and then we also got to play as the Atlan, which was super exciting. Atlan's basically the big titan that you've seen in some of the trailers already. But then the big meat of this preview was playing a much more open world level, which they called Siege. And we'll talk about Siege mainly because that's what I mostly got to experience, plus it's what I actually got to capture so I can show you some brand new Siege gameplay. And there's been a lot of discussion about this new style of level design that the team at Bethesda and id are going for with Doom: The Dark Ages, and Siege is the perfect example of what that larger, bit more open world exploration style of gameplay can actually be. And I was really impressed by it. There are what feels like these emergent pockets of gameplay that are just littered throughout the map. It's like if you had a sort of openish area that there were interconnected, miniaturized Doom levels within them. And all across the map, there's opportunities for different styles of gameplay, whether it's puzzle-based or what you're probably really into, which is the meaty combat. Sometimes there'll just be large enemies that are waiting for you in a packed-out arena, or sometimes even arenas that just appear as you're moving through the open world that trap you in an area and will only release you once you've actually tackled all the waves of enemies. Plus, like I said, loads of puzzles, and there are still secret areas to find on these bigger maps. And the enemy design that populates them is really varied, and it's actually made all the more complex with new additions like armor. So armor can only be removed by actually superheating the metal first by using something like a ballistic weapon, and I'll talk about weapons a bit more in a sec. But then what you need to do is shatter their armor so that you can actually puncture through to the fleshy goodness within by chucking your shield saw at the armor once it's glowing red, and it will just smash into a million pieces, and it's just really satisfying. And honestly, that saw shield I thought was mainly going to be for defense, but it's used much more for offense than you'd think. So holding left trigger basically brings up the shield, and you can block projectiles. You can even parry certain projectiles if they're green right back at your enemies to damage them. But what you can also do is, whilst holding the shield up, you can press right trigger, which is typically your attack button, and that'll actually make you dart across to an enemy, basically causing loads of AoE damage, and you can even upgrade this later on in the game if you need to. But it's very useful for making that big, tanky feeling Doomslayer feel a bit more agile, feel a bit more mobile, and also just ramps up the pace of the game and is a nice addition to the arsenal that you'll be using quite a lot in all of the combat that you'll encounter. Long story short, by the time I was well into this demo, I was basically using the shield as a opener attack rather than just sticking it up and hoping that I can batten down the hatches until I get close enough to get in some bludgeoning, damage of my own. But it's really cool that the shield saw is also just as good for ranged attacks as well. So it's not just for getting up close and personal or blocking damage, but you can include it as part of your ranged arsenal of weaponry as well. Left bumper basically became my best friend because I was just tossing that shield saw all around the place, bouncing it into enemies, sticking it into enemies as well, which is really useful for maybe like stunning some of those larger demons while you mop up all of the little fodder demons around them. It was just a great and versatile piece of equipment that you're going to really love in Doom: The Dark Ages. And in terms of the overall feel of this Doomslayer, you feel a bit more slow, sure, but you feel much more tanky, brooding, powerful, I don't know. Compared to Doom and Doom Eternal, where you were kind of whizzing all over the place, sometimes it felt a bit like Quake in terms of its fluidity. With Doom: The Dark Ages, I definitely felt much more like a super weapon, like this hulking brute of a Doomslayer that can just dish out carnage left, right, and center. And a lot of that has to do with the audio, I think, of the Slayer's movements. I mean, footsteps have this really nice thud and thump, and the clinking and clanking of your armor and all the metallic pieces that your character's holding, whether it's weapons, shields, armor, whatever it is. It all just adds up to this really convincing portrayal of a much more tank-like Doomslayer. I got to play through certain segments where I was using a kind of gauntlet, which sort of had these like spiky knuckle dusters on them, which was pretty sweet. But I also got to use a flail, which, oh my god, it is absolutely to die for. It's so fun to use. It's got slightly more extended range, it feels like, than the gauntlets did. And from what I could see in some of the game menus, it looks like there's a third melee weapon that you can find at some point in the game, which I don't know what it's going to be, but you know I'm going to be finding out. And Melee does have a couple of design tweaks, which I kind of appreciated because it made me value Melee a lot more in Doom the Dark Ages. And that's that you actually have to pick up Melee charges, a bit similar to picking up like ammo, for example, for the rest of your ranged weaponry. And the ranged weaponry itself is dialed in just right. I mean, you have a very varied arsenal of weapons, whether it's the Shredder, which is the gun that everybody's kind of been talking about, you know, the one that basically chews up a skull and shoots out bone fragments to like spray enemies with different ballistic damage. Very fun to use, and also has this kind of nice sort of almost engine-like hum to it when you're not using it. It's very well designed. But there's also classics like the Super Shotgun, which does make a return, but again, with that kind of medieval sort of Dark Ages spin to the design of it, it looks great. And then there seems to be quite a lot of weapon variants as well, so while you can have an assault rifle type gun, if you then later on find a variant of it, you can carry both types of weapons and swap between them freely. They'll typically have either different fire rates or fire rate patterns, so one might be burst and one might be fully automatic, for example, or maybe one just shoots out loads of big slugs instead of actually shooting out like, you know, typical bullets. Whatever it is, it basically always feels like you're going to find your favorite weapons and then be able to set your loadouts as the defaults to whichever ones that you're kind of, you know, vibing with the most at the time. Anyway, with all of that weaponry, it only feels right that we should talk a bit about the enemies, and like I said at the start, pretty varied, and it's interesting that they've added in these extra little challenges to do with, you know, figuring out armor types or figuring out just what kind of enemies that you're about to encounter, and very quickly you get quite accustomed and familiar with the different enemy types and knowing what sort of attacks they're going to be throwing your way. And this was pretty handy because honestly, being overwhelmed by enemies is actually quite commonplace in Doom the Dark Ages, and if you ask me, the best strategy is just to get stuck in. Using all the weaponry, all the abilities in your arsenal to their absolute full potential will more often than not sway the fight in your favor. And you're going to be taking huge amounts of damage in this game, but luckily we're a bit of a tankier slayer. But to be honest, if you play it smart, you just keep slaying more enemies, you're actually going to start dropping more health from those fallen demons and keep yourself in the fight. And really, that's just the combat, because like I said at the start, these open world areas are absolutely littered with side objectives, with different collectibles to find, different secret areas, all of those kind of classic Doom tropes that you come to expect of the more typical Doom level design are really well executed in this open world style as well. So I found that it was often very rewarding going off the beaten path and exploring a bit, and the map itself was very helpful for being able to point me in the right direction to where I haven't yet visited, because it kind of marks exactly where you've been in the open world. So you know, okay, I've not checked out this little nook over here, let's pop over there, maybe there's something cool for me to find. And honestly, you're going to be finding things like currency as well, which is the key way that you're going to be upgrading the Doomslayer's weapons, which seems to me like a really important part of the game and one that players shouldn't be missing out on. And I'll say that the weapon upgrading path really isn't like an afterthought whatsoever. It seems very fleshed out and kind of fine-tuned for player choice, which I really appreciated. Each tier of these upgrades for every single weapon basically had like a toggle where you could choose one side or the other. But the nice thing was that if it didn't feel right, you wanted to test it out, you could just swap it to the other side, try that out and see which one fits you best. But in order to access some of those higher tier upgrades, you will need to find certain collectibles around the map, because each level of upgrade had like a different rarity of currency to access it. But what I can imagine that this would mean for the sort of more explorative Doomslayers is that they're going to absolutely kit their arsenal out with the best of the best upgrades. And honestly, if your main mission in life is to slay demons, why wouldn't you upgrade your guns? While there is quite a lot to cover in the open world stuff, I really do want to talk a bit about the Dragon and the Atlan, because they were an absolute blast to play as. The dragons specifically, these, I don't know how the dragon is going to appear in the full game, but in this particular level, they're not just for traveling through areas or just to ride them to get from point A to point B, but they also have a deep combat system of their own. The flight does feel quite responsive though. There are boosts, climbs, dive abilities, all of that, as well as the turret that you can fire. And what's quite nice is if you are firing it whilst just flying around, you can kind of point it wherever you like, but if you're boosting, the fire rate of the turret actually increases. So if you're the sort of player that's got a real knack for flying games, you'll probably find that you're able to dish out carnage even better on the dragon than most other players. The other half of the Mecha-Dragon is much more combat focused, and that is the assault mode. So you can kind of think of this as like a focus mode or kind of like ADSing in a way, and it helps you target specific enemies. So it locks you onto them, you can move up, down, left and right, but you can also directionally dodge to avoid those enemy shots. So it kind of has a bit of parity with the Doomslayer itself, just dragon form basically. If you do manage to perfect dodge the green projectiles, it will actually supercharge the Mecha-Dragon's turret so that you can deal way more damage, which is going to come in very handy on higher difficulty modes. I feel like the Mecha-Dragons are really clever inclusion in what we already love about Doom the Dark Ages, because there'll be contextual points at which you can either ride or land the dragon. So you don't just pick it up and fly from wherever you like. There are spots on the map that have been fine-tuned to suit the dragon playstyle. So from what I can see, no, you can't just fly through any area that you like, but it means that it's kind of been constructed in a way that makes sense. Usually the points at which you would land on are either for some on-foot progression so that you can unlock a bit more of the map, like, I don't know, unlocking a gate so that your dragon can actually fly through it. Or it can also be to take down larger enemies. Sometimes you need to land on a capital ship that you've managed to disable the defenses from the air, and now you need to go and infiltrate it on foot so that you can take it down from the inside, for example. And most of the time when I did encounter moments like that, it basically meant that I had loads of different miniature dungeons that I got to travel through, explode them, and then jump out like Mission Impossible style, and my dragon will come and pick me back up again. It was all very cinematic, really fun, and I definitely can't wait to see more of it. The Atlan though, or the mecha suit, is an entirely different experience. This is like if you just bulked up the Doomslayer to a 60-foot skyscraper and just let you go absolutely ham on some of the bigger titans. And it's really clever the way that they've managed to nail the sense of scale in an Atlan, because I think it'd probably be quite easy to just make it feel like you're stomping around a model village, or, you know, but instead it does actually feel like you are that tall. And I think the audio is dialed in just right. The fact that the environments around you are destructible, it all just kind of works together to make you feel like an actual colossus. And the fights themselves, they're actually very rhythmic. It's not just you swinging as much as you can, spamming the same button over and over again. There's a bit of timing to it. There's a bit of, like, you know, strategy as well. And if you manage to time dodges perfectly, you can actually hit counter attacks as well. And then there are power moves you can trigger. There are some brutal finishing moves that are like context sensitive. It's all very Doom and very well executed. But to cut a long story short, from what I've seen of Doom the Dark Ages, this is shaping up to be an absolute dream. I only wish I got to play more, basically. But if you'd like to see some more Doom the Dark Ages content in the future, make sure you hit subscribe. Drop us down below any questions that you maybe think we didn't cover in this one, and I'll see if I can get you the answers. And of course, we'll see you in the next one, Slayers. Bye!